Hello everybody, welcome to week 3. This week we're going to be talking about media and power in the way that certain voices are privileged in our public discourses and that those voices often are in charge of providing legitimacy to authority figures. They tell us what is normal and what is not, what is allowed and what is not. And we're going to talk about exactly how that happens in our society. I'm going to be presenting in this video a couple of readings from authors who were not assigned. I encourage you to get your notes out and to keep up with this. There's going to be an awful lot of content, and I'm going to be speaking about it as briefly as possible, but this will be what is covered in the quiz that will be after, so make sure you're keeping track of what I'm talking about. The two authors we're going to be discussing are Michel Foucault, who many of you are probably quite familiar with, and his notions of how power and corrections in media work together, and Michel de Certeau, who is another French philosopher who wrote during the 80s about media and spectacle and the way that these things sort of work together to create the illusion of authority. At this point, if you haven't watched the two quick YouTube videos with my magician friend Ali in Las Vegas, please pause this and back out and go to the modules tab and watch those two videos. I think they will do a good job of framing this. I don't want to include them in this on the off chance that YouTube flags it and pulls it. They are on YouTube though, so please go watch those and then come back and see me. Assuming you have now seen the videos, what we're talking today is what makes you believe, what makes you see something and think that it is the truth, what makes you hear something or read something and not weed it out or filter it out is false, what makes you sort of accept that what you're being presented with is the truth. And as we saw with Ali on Fremont Street in Vegas, this is not always as cut and dry as we think. Beliefs are always eroding, they're always changing, they're always evolving. And just think about some of the things you were into and some of the organizations you participated in and some of the political views or religious views you held 10 years ago compared to today, and how you never would have seen where you are today, but that in many things you have changed drastically in how you believe. That's been based on new information that was presented to you as well as how it was presented. Believing today is often so much more a matter of I used to believe such and such. And I think this is important to think about. This is what the first quote I'm going to present from our philosopher Michel de Certeau. And what he is saying is that in our current culture, and this persists to this day, although this quote was written in the late 80s, he's suggesting that when somebody asks you, well, what do you believe? And you refer perhaps to your religious identity, what often happens is you just default to what your most recent belief system was. And time and again, you'll run into people who are not really practicing whatever religion they identify as, and yet they still claim this identity of that religion. And that's because in our culture and in our world and as humans, beliefs are sticky. They are used to sort of define us as who we are and who or where we belong in the world. All right, to press a little bit farther, the draw of belief has lost its luster. And just think about the last time that you went to Walmart or you ordered something online, and when it showed up, it wasn't exactly what it promised to be. Maybe the screws were a little bit cheaper than you thought. Nonetheless, advertising has sort of infiltrated every area of our culture. And because of that, it's done in the most clever and the most intricate of ways and pompous. That a lot of these products are presented as incredible products, and the wording is perfect. You can think of the pharmaceutical drug market as sort of buying the same thing. They have figured out a new language whereby they can speak about the drugs they sell and glamorize them while not lying with quotes around it, because if they were to present it as something that is unproven, they can be sued. You'll notice on a lot of dental commercials that have recently started playing in the last couple of years, they won't have a dentist speaking. Instead, they will have a patient speaking that will say something like, I'm sure that a dentist is going to approve this, or I'm sure that dentists everywhere will recommend such and such toothpaste. This has sort of just become a normal way of being in the world, is that daily we are bombarded with these messages from all sides, and they're all promising us something. And we sort of become accustomed to weeding through that smog of atmosphere that is around us and making our way through the world despite all of the problems we encounter related to that. For Desserteau, when it came to belief and where the real power of belief lied, he believed that it was in the communication of a belief. He was a firm proponent of the idea that if you believe something or not didn't really matter so long as you were willing to communicate to others around you, and that was where the real power lied. In other words, by saying something and communicating it, especially to a large audience, that it did not matter if you believed what you were saying or not. So long as that message struck chords with your audience, you were likely to get people on your side. And you can think back to the last election here and sort of put that into context and think it did not really matter if Mr. Trump really thought that when Mexico was sending its people, they were sending rapists and criminals. His words went out into real time, and they struck a chord, along with a lot of the other things he said throughout the election, that in the end, provided the rules that are currently in place, won him the White House. It didn't matter if he was saying these things in truth or not. It was simply in saying them in those communicative messages going out and striking the right chord with his audience that he was able to exercise power. So the same sort of thinking is evident in the age-old tale of Burr Rabbit, which has ties all the way back to the slave plantations in the early United States. And it was a story of empowerment. It was a story that often was traded amongst slaves to describe how power works and how it can always be flipped on its head if communication is strategically deployed to influence those who are receiving messages. And in this case, as you can see for the picture, and as many of you know from hearing this story as children, the story goes that the fox has been chasing the rabbit for some time and finally catches it and has it. And there's no escape, right? It's just going to be rabbit stew tonight, and that the only recourse this bunny has is to strategically deploy some communicative message that lets this fox know something that forces him to maybe release the bunny. And so what the bunny does is say, oh man, you can eat me and that's terrible, you can torture me, you can kill me, right? But whatever you do, don't throw me in that briar patch because it would just be the worst thing ever for me. Knowing full well that this fox has this long-standing vendetta and grudge against this rabbit, which he hasn't been able to effectively capture despite his best efforts, and now he has him. And so he thinks to himself, awesome, not only am I going to eat rabbit stew tonight, but first I'm going to torture this rabbit. And so he throws him in the briar patch, believing that this is the worst torture that can be inflicted. Those of us that know about rabbits know that they do fine in briar patches. They thrive there. They can run right through the bottom of them, whereas the fox is now unable to chase the rabbit because he's in the briar patch. So I think this is a great story, again, of how the roots of communication and strategic communication to influence people's perceptions go way back. This is how we cause people to believe. So I included some quotes here. Feel free to read through them. I'm not going to read them to you, but rather, Desserteau makes this point again that the news is not truth, and this is actually something that's been brought to light a lot more in recent years as we've entered the era of what Trump has termed fake news and sort of fooled ourselves into thinking that something has changed drastically as opposed to examining what's going on as maybe a pendulum swinging one way or the other. But the point here is that we all turn on the news and we assume we're getting something like the truth, and time and again, that's not necessarily the case. But that the news sort of constitutes our belief system, our orthodoxy. We see what we see, and it's all that we have. What can we compare it to? Here are some more quotes to sort of go along with this idea, and these are directly from Desserteau's work. So again, if this is the sort of language that entices you and you want more, feel free to look it up. And if it's really heady and too much for you, you're welcome for just providing brief quotes. But effectively that it's impossible to watch television and to not learn something. And this goes beyond just news. We can also talk about fictional narratives. But I want to go even further and step outside of the television altogether and point out that we never escape this network. We never escape this web of power and intricate interactions reaching out trying to tell us things. And we can see this just in a simple drive down the street, right? We can see that if you were to drive by the New York Times building in New York City, you would see that truth is plastered in huge letters outside the building, at least on this particular day, and that there's a message communicated there. And even if you don't believe it, because each individual receives and transponds this message differently, Even if you don't believe it, you actually still absorb something from walking and driving by there. You either think, oh, the New York Times is a truthful organization, the word truth is associated with it, or you may think, oh, look, the New York Times is trying to portray themselves as a truthful organization. We can look at some of the other things on here. The first one was SpongeBob SquarePants and a message that is communicating as you walk by on the street the normalcy of a cultural icon, SpongeBob, right? The normalcy of a certain sort of painting and how certain things can be happy and funny, like big glasses on a baby. We drive by the got dabs, for example, down on the right left or the right bottom of the screen, and such messages normalize marijuana use in our culture. A lot of people don't even know what that is, and they may ask somebody in the car, what's a dabs? And then there's a conversation that maybe wouldn't take place otherwise. And we can see with Coca-Cola and with Kit Kat alike, the normalization of certain food products is just a staple of American culture. These things are just there every time we go out. We can't avoid them. Looking a little deeper here, you can see that often messages don't even have to be explicit, and you can read beyond. So when we see, for example, the one down in the middle, the United States Penitentiary picture is actually a modern contemporary picture I took just last year at Alcatraz, the penitentiary. And when you see some of these things, there's more of a message communicated than when you would think. Knowing this is Alcatraz, suddenly we all ask the question, why are these messages there? Why does it say Indians welcome? And that is because 30 years ago there was a group of people that came from all around the country and occupied the island after the prison closed. And there's a great history there. Everybody should be intrigued by signs and messages like this and want to learn more. Just next to it, waiting room for whites only. This sign says much more than what it actually says. It's a historical artifact that lets us know there was an era in our culture where things were a certain way, and at the time, signs like this articulated our existence, to borrow Desserteau's words. They taught us what must be. Consider how the fitting room sign says actually a lot more than the fact that there's just a fitting room here. It points out that it's positioned in a gender binary culture, and it points out that there are some limited options available for people with disabled identities. Think about the big yellow banner to the left on the top and how it represents to almost anybody that has seen a television show who has been to any sort of travel hub. Like you are probably in an airport or a train station. And then think of the skull and crossbones on the bottom, which has no words at all, and how even from seeing it, we all know exactly what it is that we're supposed to take away from these messages. And again, we see these messages and signs everywhere. It's hard to really get through an inch of our day without looking at your phone and seeing an update in status, a news story. You tune in on TV and you see plenty of smiling faces positioned just so. Most of us know what the red stop sign is, even if the words weren't on it. The big white cross in the middle, there's, I believe, 57 of these nationwide on the sides of freeways, and they're massive 50-foot high crosses. We're constantly just immersed in this smog of messages bombarding us from all sides, telling us to believe this and to buy that and to use this to cure that. And it's important to recognize that we've just sort of become immune to it as a survival mechanism. We often don't even notice the noise. Think about this. Many of us are actually, until the second we go to sleep, surrounded by messages. And again, this goes beyond the news. Anybody that's watched The Shawshank Redemption knows that they learned something about prison from that movie. Even those of us that have been into a prison to see how it actually works know that you still take away something from movies like that, be it the atmosphere or the inmate behavior or the way that guards behave. And we can imagine this now for those that are watching Orange is the New Black. But you sort of take away something from that gives you an idea of how prison works. So I've put a list up on your screen. This is what I want to sort of end with, is thinking about some of the many misconceptions that we all just sort of absorb, in this case from Hollywood, but these are things that many of us just take for granted. All of these are for the most part false, and some of them are outright lies. This idea that we only use 10% of our brains has been repeated ad nauseum on media, from the news all the way to Hollywood fictional narratives, and it's simply not true. The idea that we have to save the rainforest because where else will our oxygen come from? But in reality, the rainforest is not where we get most of the oxygen on Earth right now. There's a lot of things that are sort of just built into our rhetoric that are completely fabricated. We get these images of police officers as superheroes who say, "Cover me," and then they run into flaming houses or to bullet-ridden situations to save people from danger, right? Time and again, we all walk into these narratives knowing full well that it is, to use Desserteau's words one more time, it's so much hogwash, and yet we still walk away thinking, for instance, that maybe if an elevator gets stopped, there's a magic hatch in the roof where I could crawl out, when in reality, again, this is not the case. So most of you by now have probably made the connection here that we're talking about belief and doubt, particularly with politicians and politics. How do you get people to really believe in an era and a day and age when everybody is trying to get them to believe and everything comes with a promise and a guarantee? We're so used to weeding through daily this chorus of promises that we know are not true. How is it that somebody can actually get you up off of your seat and get you out to vote when nowadays they have to promise so much more to do that? And I want to think back to Obama and the way that he used this idea of hope and change combined with what at the time was like this magic dream that sort of permeated the American atmosphere of electing the first man of color ever to the Oval Office, and how that sort of propelled him and propelled this belief that went with him, hope and change. We believed, we really thought things were going to be different. And how we can look at Trump and see that the same thing happened. He said some things, many things, and he deployed messages all along the way that really made people believe a list of things. They believed, for instance, that America needed to go back to a place where it used to be, where things were great. And everybody sort of was allowed to make their own objective definition of what that meant. But again, it's important to recognize this was all about belief. This was a deploying of belief. This was getting a hold of people's beliefs and getting them up off of their seats. So keep this in mind as you watch the video that is assigned for this week, the movie rather, and we're going to talk about this a lot more as the quarter progresses. This will become sort of the center hub of a lot of our discussions, is how is it that you get people to believe enough to get them to act, to get them up off their couch and out to the voting booths, to get them into a store or an online store to order and buy something from you with their coin. So make sure you complete your assignments this week and watch the movie that is attached in the module section, and I will see you all next week.